Hello YouTube, this is Sam Gerrans from Qur'anic.com. Today is Tuesday the 9th of April 2019. I've been very busy editing and writing and stuff like that, but I wanted to make a short video. Now this is not highly sort of annotated and referenced and so on. It's more sort of general impressions and so on. It's the basis perhaps for a fuller article at a later date. But I wanted to address this because I don't think I'm alone in these sorts of thoughts, and it's to do with the concept, the Jewish concept, and the Christian dependent concept, or even co-opting concept of the Messiah. What we mean by that, how that affects us as people who believe in the Quran, Because my impression is that there's a bit of a sore spot certainly for traditionalist Muslims. They feel that there's this party going on somewhere else with the Messiah kind of coming or not coming, or being or not being. And obviously the Quran talks about Isa ibn Maryam, and he is al-Masih, he is the anointed one. But the Jews, or those who sort of arrogate to themselves the Hebrew scriptures, they have this whole narrative about, well, mainly themselves actually, and then the Christians have got another narrative also mainly about themselves. And I think those who call themselves Muslims have felt like they're kind of missing out somehow. They haven't got the right suit on. In my spare time, when I'm not doing what I'm doing now, or when I'm not working on the text and so on, for light relief, I listen to various types of debates, various types of presentations from different religious sort of points of view and so on. One person that I listen to sometimes is Rabbi Tobias Singer, and his whole presentation vis-a-vis Christianity, because what he's really trying to do is plug the dike of the leakage of people who identify as Jewish into the arms of the Christians. And I go along with his presentation to quite a considerable extent. There is a presentation with him debating a Messianic Jew called Michael Brown. And Tobias Singer did rather get his head handed to him on a plate on that one. There are other debates, I'm sure people listening have listened to them, between sort of full-on Trinitarian Christians, the sort of weak handshake, blithe, smiling type of Christian. Michael Brown isn't like that. He's a Messianic Jewish Christian. And so anyway, it's quite interesting hearing their various perceptions. I've got notes here, which is why I'm looking down, on what they call the Messiah. What I found interesting, having listened to quite a lot of this stuff, is, and it's true in politics, obviously people disagree, otherwise they wouldn't be arguing, but it's always interesting to note where they all agree. I'm not going to go into the whole political spectrum, but if you look at the so-called opposing forces between so-called left and so-called right, now they all agree. They all agree that homosexuality is kind of fine, and a whole load of other things are just beyond discussion. So those things are already sort of taken into the this isn't going to change camp, and then they argue about some sort of extraneous, more obviously divergent points of view. Well, it's very interesting that Tobias Singer, when he's debating the Christians, in this case the Messianic Christian, if you don't know what Messianic, well, it's Messianic Jew. It's basically, and I can completely I get Tobias Singer's irritation with it all, because what the Christians did was decide, how can we get the Jews to become Christians? Because the Jews, it's a bit convoluted, but the Christians need Jews to become Christians, almost as a sort of mechanism for their eschatological expectations, because Jesus can't come back until Jews have become Christians. So this is the extent of their compassion toward Jews. And were I a Jew, I would be highly irritated by this entire thing, I have to say. So, emotionally, I'm with Tobias Singer to quite a large extent, but not ideologically very far. But what is interesting is how far they all agree with each other on the question of being Jewish, how special and wonderful and, beyond any kind of criticism that is. and on the specialness of Israel. So these are the things, they don't argue about that. Those they all agree upon. It doesn't matter Christian, Jew, Messianic, Christian, rabbi, rabbinic, it doesn't matter. They all agree on these things. They got no argument on any of that. So that's quite interesting. But I'm going to get into the question of the Messiah, as we say in English, Mashiach in Hebrew and Messiah in Arabic. Now, let's start with what the Christians call the Old Testament and what Jews call our Bible. The word Mashiach occurs in the Hebrew scriptures a total of 39 times. Now, nowhere, you may be interested to know, nowhere does this word reference, when it's used either with an article, ha-Mashiach, or without an article, a definite article, nowhere does it reference the Messiah. Nowhere. And they'll tell you this. What there are passages which are said to be messianic, said to reference an age which is messianic. There is reference to a prince. There's all kinds of different bits and pieces, but really it's a bit like it's very similar to traditionalist Islam in the sense that they're starting with with a conclusion and working backwards on that basis, and you kind of have to assume the conclusions in order to get the argument. So within this idea, they have passages from Ezekiel, Zechariah, Hosea, and various other bits and pieces which are said to refer to this establishment of the new temple, of an age when all this is going to be, when basically those who call themselves Jews are going to inherit their kingdom, and we, the unwashed masses, best case scenario, following Noahide laws, we're going to be second and third and fourth class citizens. How wonderful that's all going to be. Now, the Christians kind of agree with the postulates of this. The Christians, you see, I'm not going to get into the deepness of it, but Christianity is utterly dependent upon Judaism. It is. And because it's assuming all of its conclusions, all it's doing is saying, we agree with your conclusions, we just don't agree with your working out. We agree that this is all about the Messiah, but we're saying that Messiah is our Messiah, and that Messiah is Jesus, whoever we mean by that. By Jesus, they mean a man who lived about 2,000 years ago and was probably murdered by the Romans at the behest of the Jews. Now, the Jews will, and I'm talking Jews about religious Jews, I'm not talking about Jews in general, quite understandably, given their worldview, I don't agree with their worldview, but given that worldview, Tavir Singer says it best. He said, why did God allow the creation of what they call the Mormons? It's so that Christians could understand how Jews feel. Were I a Jew, I would feel severely encroached upon by what Christians do with the Hebrew Bible. They kind of muscle their way in, say we accept all of your work, we accept all of your conclusions, but now this is ours because we're going to arrogate this to us on the basis of something that hasn't happened yet. Now, I don't want to get specifically into this, but Jews have got an absolute point, because they're saying, well, the Mashiach, as we understand it, based actually in the Talmud and then worked backwards onto the Hebrew scriptures, has this and this and this characteristic, and your Messiah doesn't fulfill any of those. Is he a king? No. Is he set up Israel over the nations? Is he, is he X? Is he Y? Is he Z? And the Christian says, well, not yet, but he's going to be that. And the Christian says, and the Jew says, well, he's not that, so we're not going to accept him. Well, my point is, I don't accept either of these arguments. It's a false argument. It's a false debate. It only exists if you accept as a priori a fact, working backwards from the Talmudic assumptions and then working those assumptions upon the Hebrew text, that this thing actually is a indicative of this messianic age. for me, as someone who accepts the veracity of the Quran, all of this is purely speculative. Now, obviously, the Christians are locked into this. They've painted themselves into a corner, because without all of this, everything that Paul says, and Paul absolutely, rests the Hebrew scriptures to his own damnation, and I agree with Tobias Singer and all of that. However, they're locked into this. There's no way out of this whole Mashiach narrative for them. It's worthy of note that this whole Mashiach narrative, and by Mashiach narrative, what do I mean? I don't just mean that there is an anointed person, because as I say, this term occurs 39 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It references Cyrus at least once, who is a non-Jew, whatever we mean by that. He's a non-Hebrew, he's a not of the children of Israel, and he was Mashiach. Mainly, the word Mashiach occurs most frequently in the book of Leviticus, because it's, whenever a priest was anointed, he became Mashiach. But that's not what Christians mean by Mashiach, and it's not what Jews mean by Mashiach, capital M. They mean something else. So what's happened is the Jews have taken this word and ascribed a meaning to it, something other than what it naturally and natively means, and then the Christians have muscled in on that and said, no, that's ours now. And as I sort of said at the beginning of this, that the Muslims have been left there feeling like, me too, what am I going to do about this? I'll get to that bit in a minute. But what's interesting is, if we take the religion of Judaism, it's founded upon the Torah. Nowhere is there any overt, even intimation of this in the books of Moses. Nothing. Doesn't exist. Okay? So what we have is a Jewish conceit based upon the Talmud and retrospectively overlaid upon the Tanakh, the later portions thereof. We're not talking here about the Torah. And then that has been co-opted somewhat by the Christian. So we've got a sort of a storm in a teacup as far as I'm concerned, because none of this means anything to me. I'm not interested in it, but I have to critique it because I want to get to the point of Isa ibn Maryam al-Masih, what the Quran calls the Messiah, and what we mean by that. But before I get to that, the question which comes to my mind is how I'm not really that interested in the Christian narrative. It's a dependent argument. If we can shoot down the Jewish argument, the Christian argument just dies a death all by itself. So that's the end of that one. So how reliable are the Jews and how reliable is the Jewish narrative? And for me personally, I have to say not very, and there are reasons for that. Now, if you listen to a lot of people like Tobias Singer and there's another guy, Rabbi Sobchak or something, they're impressive. They're intelligent men. They clearly believe what they say. I think that they are genuine to some extent, or maybe some great extent. I have no window into their soul. I have no idea. They're certainly very learned in their own spheres. So that's that bit. But how reliable are they for me? Because it's quite impressive. You listen to quite a lot of this stuff and you start to think, well, perhaps we should be going, finding why isn't this all in the Quran? Well, it's not that it just isn't there. And we'll get into the significance of that in a minute. But for me, the reliability of the Jewish mindset in terms of broad mythos is not reliable, and there are some reasons why it's not reliable. One is that if you listen to almost all of these types of speakers, they make no qualitative distinction between their narratives, which in the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, and what they call the Holocaust. You see, they sort of blithely sweep through this as if it was all one continuation. There's no criticism at any point. There's no holding up the narrative to see if it really is true. And we're talking here about the Jewish experience in the Second World War. So there's no objective there is a pre-existing allegiance to the specialness and qualitative superiority of what it is, whatever we mean by this term of Jewishness, and there is no real sort of ability to step outside of this pre-existing bubble that I've seen from the people that I've watched. I do see it to some extent in academics. I see it to some extent in academics, and to some extent in some secular Zionists. They do seem more able to stand outside of that bubble. But I'm talking here about the religiously minded Jews that I've listened to. So the fact they can't make any distinction between one story, let's take the story of Esther, and then the Spielberg, and it is a Hollywood version of what happened to Jews in the Second World War, and that this is all basically one narrative to them, stitched together of one cloth, and it's all seems to have the same kind of emotional waft and web underpinning it. And there's at no point is there any real certainly no self-criticism and no even objective analysis. That means for me personally that they're not highly reliable or particularly interesting as purveyors of what we might call theological argument or theological narrative. The next point is that they see Christians, and I'm saying I'm obviously I'm generalizing on the sort of totality of what I've listened to, but I think it's a fair generalization that the religious Jewish and also non-religious Jewish worldview seems to be that Christians are the problem. There's some fundamental flaw in the Christian DNA that gives rise to what they call anti-Semitism. Now, I'm not a Jew, but were I a Jew, I have to say, if my people had been kicked out of over 100 countries in the last few centuries and persecuted, there's no doubt about it, they've definitely been persecuted, I would want to know why. And the only answer seems to be because there's something wrong with everybody else. Well, if we were applying this to anybody else, we'd say that you're a psychopath or a sociopath. This is sociopathic behavior. So when Jews ask, as they typically do, why me? Why us? They don't want an answer. They've got an answer which comes from the fact that you're flawed. You're in some way, and there's some sort of fundamental DNA corruption within you, which means that you are anti-them. I mean, if anybody else did this in any other scenario, you'd say you're a psychopath. And quite frankly, it comes across that way. So it's not my place. I don't really care about all of this. I'm just saying this is why they're not particularly convincing. Anybody who can't see that, anybody who actually has never asked, why me, why us, after all of this time, and wanted an answer, sorry about that, has got to be in some way psychopathic as a culture. And it's what I see over and over and over again. Am I saying all Jews are like this? I don't think so. I certainly hope not. But if it were Russians, or it were Irish people, or it were it were just say Protestants or something. I mean, what we mean by Jew is a whole separate question. I think there would be some attempt to answer the question why us outside of the very limited area of it's something wrong with everybody else. Whatever the rights and wrongs of all that are not what I'm looking at right now. What I'm just saying is that a demographic that's not able to ask that question and to look for answers, for me, they are thereby excluding themselves from the ranks of those who can put forth, who really are qualified to pronounce upon the narratives of Scripture because of their inherent blindness to obvious narrative threads. That's what I'm trying to say. So, moving to briefly to the Christians, the Christians' narrative is really a function. It's a derivative of the Jewish assertions. The Jewish assertions are extraneous. They're not native to to the actual scriptures. They are taken from elsewhere and then imported. Those values are imported. If you know my work and how I analyze the Quran, these sorts of concepts will be familiar to you. This isn't something that is the preserve of Jews or anybody else. It's just what humans do when they try to, expound upon and create religions based upon, or at least in some way signaling, signposting some kind of written scripture. So the Christians' attempt at this creates a Mashiach or a Messiah who is sort of one or two steps removed from what we've just been describing. And again, having, if one accepts that, or at least as far as I'm concerned, I've, discounted the Jewish narrative and sort of qualifications to narrate, for me, the Christian falls just as a sort of a function of that initial move. If we move to the Quran, what's very interesting to me, what I've learned in some of my recent studies, looking particularly at the story of Musa vis-a-vis Fir'aun, is what's not there. There is no Passover, not in the Quran, and there is one verse that you can say, well, possibly this refers to the Passover. I think it's 10:13, certainly in the 10th chapter. However, the Quran is very specific that there were 9 signs for Fir'aun. There were the 2 signs that Musa had with casting down the staff, and then with the hand becoming white, and then there were 7 plagues. And nowhere in those list of 7 plagues does it say anything about the death of the firstborns. Not there. So whatever we mean about the other verse, you need the death of the firstborn for the Passover to have been a feature. It's not there. So the Quran, and if you don't accept the Quran, fine, move on. But the Quran claims to be from God, it claims to be preserved, and it claims to be not only a confirmation of previous scriptures, but also a control over them. So the absence in that scripture of any mention of this event, this defining event, this Passover event, which is fundamental to what the Jewish kind of self-conception, and utterly central to the Christian arrogation to itself of this original conception, because they see Jesus as the Lamb taking away the sins of the world and all this. They're taking the symbology from the Jewish religion. However, looking at the Quran, none of this is there. It screams that, sometimes you kind of look for why isn't that there? When you read, not just to look at what is there, but what isn't there. This is central. This isn't just some sort of, minor event somewhere. The fact that there is no Passover in the Quran, and impossible for it to be there on the basis of overt statements, that says something. The second thing, which is not there in the Quran, not there, and it kind of should be, if it were what the Jewish scriptures claim, and certainly what the rabbis claim for the Jewish scriptures, circumcision is not there. That covenant, which is the central and defining, I would say, or at least one of them covenants in the conception of what Jewishness means, is not in the Quran. I'm not saying Jews shouldn't circumcise their sons. I'm not saying that Jewish religion is somehow, abrogated or entirely false. I'm not saying that at all. That's not my argument. My argument is that for somebody who follows the Quran and looks to the Quran for the guidance, there is no reason in any way to be particularly, I suppose, inhibited by the claims of Judaism or Christianity. The Quran is very clear. Those who believe in God in the last day and do good works, righteous deeds, they have their rewards. That extends to the Jews, that extends to Christians, extends to anybody who believes in God alone. Obviously, the Jews have got their exaggerations about themselves, and the Quran addresses that, and the Christians have their exaggerations and their idolatry, which is what Trinitarianism is, and the Quran exhorts them and warns them to pull away from that. But outside of those kind of minor corrections, these are things for the last day. These are things, God sees all things. He is the witness. He is above all things, and to him we are returning. So these are not our problems. They're not people clearly come from different backgrounds and they grow up in different traditions and so on. And ultimately, it's not so important, I suppose. It's not the primary importance which workshop you're in. It's of most importance what one makes in the workshop. So I'm not, decrying Judaism or Christianity. I'm trying to put their claims, and they are very vociferous claims. They're vociferous claims, and there's lots of money behind this. There are all kinds of rabbis out there being supported, being paid tons and tons and tons to keep this stuff going. It's been churned out day and night. And all I'm trying to say is that as a Qur'anic Muslim, as somebody who holds to the Qur'an alone, I'm just sort of indicating my path through this. You see, one last part before I get to wrap this up. Another thing which is not in the Qur'an. The Qur'an talks about Bani Israel, and it talks about Yaqub. Bani Israel is the sons of the children of Israel. So that concept exists. Ya Bani Israel, children of Israel. And it exhorts the children of Israel to many things. It calls them back to follow God alone, to follow the Torah, So this concept is native to the Quran without a doubt. And Yaqub, Jacob, features in a number of places in the Quran. It features, most, I suppose, predominantly in parts of Al-Baqarah, the second surah, and Yusuf, the 12th surah. But nowhere does the Quran make any link between Yaqub and Israel. Now, I'm not saying that Yaqub isn't or is Israel. I'm just saying that this connection is not made. See, this is in Genesis, is when God, after Jacob wrestles with the angel and so on, after sleeping on the Jacob's ladder, that he's renamed as Israel. That may be the case. That's it's an interesting narrative, but it's not binding upon me in any way. And it's interesting that it's not in the Quran. You see, because this is so much again the very core of the Jewish racial conceit and the derivative Christian messianic conceit. These founding blocks are not there. Now, to move to the Quran, or rather, firstly, to the traditionalist Muslims' attempts with the Quran. As I said when I opened, the traditionalist Muslim has somewhat felt a little bit lost here, and that there's this big party going on, and he really sort of needs a position on all of this. Well, the position is very clear, is that according to the Quran, Isa ibn Maryam, whoever he was al-Masih, was the Messiah, whatever we mean by that. So I don't actually personally care what the Jews mean by it, because I know that Isa ibn Maryam was that man. It's established as a fact. I don't care particularly what the Christians mean by it either, or who they mean by, was Isa ibn Maryam the same as, Jesus of Nazareth or Yeshua? I don't know, and nor do they actually. So, but what I do know is that whatever Messiah means, and it from the context, it looks as though Isa ibn Maryam was sent to the Bani Israel to, with a mission to them. The fact that this term has been exploded in and been given a whole range of new meanings, and then a whole extraneous eschatological and semi-eschatological set of narratives ascribed to it, that's a separate issue, and that's an issue for other people to look at. I'm looking at the Quran as something which is not only a confirmation of previous scriptures, but a control over it. And this second part is something which I think Muslims often miss. It's a control. It's not that we try to sort of twist the scripture in some way so that it's subservient to or comport with what's gone before. No, it's if there's a contradiction, then the Quran that's it. That's the answer for me. I mean, I'm not a Jew, I'm not a Christian, so that's my answer. I'm not really interested in the rest of it. So we know that whatever is meant by Messiah, Isa ibn Maryam, was that. We also know that the efforts of various Muslim exegetes, notwithstanding that Jesus lived and he died. And he says, peace be upon me the day I live, the day I die, and the day I'm raised. And they say, you see, he didn't really die. No. This term, this exact same phrase is used by Yahya, and no one is claiming that Yahya didn't die a normal human death. We do know from the Quran that the Jews or the Bani Israel did not kill Isa ibn Maryam. They were not responsible for his death. So we just take these key points. It's a bit like like a constellation of stars. You just hit those key points. If those are in place, the rest of it will be in place. It's a bit of a bit of a segue into an unrelated topic. But I once was friendly with a chap. He was a mechanic, and he was telling me about his work. And if a car gets hit and the chassis gets put out of whack, the way they put it right is that on the chassis of a car there'll be these key points, just dots, and they put this broken or this mangled chassis onto some sort of machine, and it'll pull using these dots as coordinates. And once these dots are all in place, 5 or 10 dots, whatever it is on the chassis of the car, the whole chassis will be correct. Well, this is what the Quran gives us. It gives us these key points. So I don't really, I don't really care about the rest of it. If these key points are aligned, then the rest of it will be aligned also. We know also that the Quran is very clear that whatever we mean by Mashiach or Messiah, Isa ibn Maryam was not God. He was a created being like Maryam, like every human being that's ever lived, you see. So the Quran is there to correct these things. And from my point of view, I think that the whole Mashiach story, as regards the Jews and the Christians and so on, it's a storm in a teacup. It's a non-story. It's a non-narrative. Certainly there are these parts of the Tanakh which talk about a time to come. Okay, there's a time to come. Who knows? Maybe it's after the end of, maybe it's after the hour. Who knows when it is? I don't know. But I do know that it's got nothing to do with Messiah. Why? Because he's been and gone, whatever we mean by that, and he's dead. That's it. And so the Jews are wrong in that sense, and the Christians are wrong in that sense, and that's according to the Quran. If you don't accept the Quran, you don't agree with the Quran, you don't like it, doesn't fit with, that's fine, a separate issue. But I'm talking about what the Quran actually says regarding this very thorny subject, and there's so much on it, and there's, a lot of, almost irredentist theology out there. Almost, it's a new, looking at what's happening between the Jews and the Christians, certainly with some elements of the Jewish camp. This is a sort of theological colonialism, trying to expand the concept of Israel to take in these broader and broader and wider circles, being a lot of this is founded on this Mashiach narrative and this chosenness, etc. If that's your thing, knock yourself out. I couldn't care less. But the Quran is very clear that whatever you want to make up or whatever you want to do with that's your your business. But the fact is that Isa ibn Maryam was Messiah. That's just a fact according to the Quran. And the Quran says to us, or says to the believers, if you were to follow their vain desires after what's come, well, actually it's in the masculine singular, after what's come to thee, then you would find, against God no protector. So for myself, I don't want to follow this stuff. I'm sure there are some, good and righteous, and I certainly hope and pray that there are many of them in both those two camps. But knowing what I know about the Quran, for me to follow this stuff, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to stay focused on what's real, and I just wanted to share that with people. I know that I haven't backed this up with tons of references and so on. I just don't have time at the moment to write that sort of article. I'm very focused on other things, but I just wanted to get that out there. That's all for now. If you're listening on YouTube, you can download my full translation of the Quran free using the button in the top right hand corner, or buy the hard copy there at 10% less than on Amazon. I also encourage you to sign up for the Qur'anic Plus newsletter on the site to get occasional micro updates. You can download the audio from my YouTube videos to your mobile device using the links in the drop down below. I recommend meetquranites.com to connect with other Quran alone believers. Like if you like, comment if you have something constructive to say, and subscribe to get more each week. And use the link in the drop down below to donate if you would like to help me keep doing this. And remember, this life is short, eternity is long. If you want good trees, plant good seeds.